2.2.1 Group 1. Books attributed to deceased individuals, whose identities while alive are uncertain. The two principal alleged authors in this group are Emmanuel, presented as Xavier's spiritual guide, and André Luiz, a supposed Brazilian physician who preferred not to reveal his identity. Xavier wrote more than 120 books attributed to Emmanuel and around 25 attributed to André Luiz. Emmanuel's books dealt with historical, religious, moral, Christian, biblical, spiritual, and social themes. He is the supposed author, for example, of 5 novels containing a very expressive body of historical knowledge about Rome in the 1st century, 2,000 years ago, 1939, Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, 50 years later, 1940, and Hail, Christ, 1953. Europe and America in the 17th century, Renunciation, 1943, and the lives of Saints Paul and Stephen, biblical figures of the New Testament, Paul and Stephen, 1942. In what follows, we present a passage from one of his mediumistic historical novels, along with an analysis of the data as performed by Di Spirito. Example: excerpt from the mediumistic book 2,000 Years Ago, 1939. The passage talks about the tragic fate of Saul, a young Jew who was sold as a slave by determination of the Roman senator Publius Lentulus. This novel presents elements based on historical facts, portraying rules for the sale of slaves in ancient Rome. Young Saul had vanished from prison in what pointed to a desperate and unforeseen escape. This information was relayed to Publius Lentulus without him knowing that corrupt civil servants often sold young prisoners to ambitious slave traders who operated within the more populous sectors of the capital of the world. In nearly all the Roman provinces, dreadful groups of thugs lived in the shadow of the state structure as unscrupulous traders of human beings. The young Jew, with his youthful vigor and health, had fallen victim to these soulless creatures. Sold with others to powerful Roman slave traders, he was put on a ship in the ancient port of Joppa and was bound for the capital of the empire. Moving ahead 2 months in our chronology of events, we find him on a large platform near the Forum, where men, women, and children all together are lined up nearly naked. Open comment A. In ancient Rome, the slaves' clothes were removed as a way to allow the identification of physical deficiencies or illnesses. Close comment, with a small placard hanging from their necks. Open comment B. Slaves were placed on a platform with a placard around their neck, showing age, abilities, and bodily defects, if any. Close comment. Eyes ablaze with revenge, Saul stood there semi-nude, a white woolen cap covering his head. Open comment C. This accessory, barrete in Portuguese, was used when a captive had difficulties in submitting to his master, as a guarantee to show the buyers the disobedient slaves. Therefore, the acquirer could not complain later on the fact that he had bought an insurgent slave. Notably, the Portuguese word barrete is not used today, and to understand its meaning, we refer to the Italian word barretta. This particularity illustrates some of the examples of the etymological link with Roman history. Close comment, and his bare feet lightly dusted with gypsum. Open comment D. Painting someone's feet with gypsum meant they came from overseas. This data was especially relevant to the acquirer for several reasons, among which knowledge of the slave's culture and language could be determined. Close comment. In the midst of that cluster of unfortunate beings walked a man of ignoble and repulsive features, shouting in a raspy voice to the crowd of curious onlookers surrounding him, "Citizens, come take a look. As you know, I am in no hurry to dispose of my merchandise, because I owe no one, but I am here to serve you, illustrious Romans." and pausing in front of this or that human merchandise to call the crowd's attention, he continued in his crude and insulting harangue, "Look at this lad. He is a superb example of health, thrift, and submissiveness. He obeys at the first command. Take a good look at the strength of his flesh. Disease will never attack it. Look at this man. He speaks good Greek and is well made from head to toe." With this commercial pitch, he continued advertising each individual before the multitude of buyers who besieged him, until finally it was young Saul's turn. The young man reflected his rage and ferocious sentiments despite his miserable appearance. Check out this lad. He has just arrived from Judea as the finest example of temperance and health, obedience and strength. He is one of the finest samples of today's lot. Look at his youthfulness. Illustrious Romans, I am offering him at the small price of 5,000 sesterces. The young slave stared at the trader, his heart boiling with hatred and the fiercest desires for revenge. A bustle of curiosity formed around this interesting and highly original figure, his Jewish features certainly making an impression on the square's crowd that morning. The book 2,000 years ago, 1939, is accurate because not only does it reveal Roman rules that indeed existed, but it also demonstrates the peculiar situation of Saul as expressed through the context presented. The novel's author, however, never provides a direct explanation of each of these strange practices. Instead, he narrates the history as a witness to them. Markedly, when the books were composed in 1939, the texts containing the historical information regarding the sale of slaves in ancient Rome were available only in Latin, whereas other indirect sources commenting on these texts were available only in English. Javier, however, stated that he never researched any of these themes before psychographing the books. Parenthetically, when he wrote many of his books during the late 1930s, he was busy working several hours or taking care of 14 siblings, making it difficult for him to perform any research. In this sense, researcher Playfair commented, Emmanuel began his literary output with a series of 5 historical novels, 4 of which appeared between 1939 and 1942, and the 5th in 1953. The first 2, totaling 734 pages, were written in the same year. The third, Chico's longest single book, set in the 1st century Rome, runs to 553 pages and took him 8 months to write. They were all, of course, written at a time when Chico was a full-time government employee with only evenings for literary activity. By comparison, Lew Wallace's historical novel Ben-Hur, set in the same period, took 8 years to research and write. The books attributed to André Louis are mainly stories and descriptions about the spiritual world. His debut book, for example, No Solar, Life in the Spirit World, 1944, presents a city inhabited by deceased people. Because the spiritual author introduces himself as a doctor, his texts highlight knowledge of biological areas, relating them to spiritist topics such as mediumship. Javier declared that although he had psychographed André Louis's books, he was not able to understand the content of some of them, such as In Evolution in Two Worlds, 1958, and The Mechanics of Mediumship, 1960. Strikingly, some books attributed to André Louis were produced in co-authorship with Javier's friend, Waldo Vieira, also a medium, who did not live in the same city at the time. In the book Evolution in Two Worlds, 1959, Vieira would receive André Louis on Wednesday nights and write the odd chapters, whereas Javier would receive the spirit on Sunday nights and write the even chapters. The composition of this book is an example of the so-called cross-correspondence phenomenon, wherein different mediums receive pieces of information unknown to each other that make greater sense when combined. The books by André Louis also brought pieces of information about the pineal gland at a time when scientists knew very little about it. In 2013, the scientific journal Neuroendocrinology Letters published an article entitled Historical and Cultural Aspects of the Pineal Gland, comparison between theories provided by Spiritism in the 1940s and the current scientific evidence. The researchers compared descriptions of the pineal gland and the epiphysis in 13 books written by André Louis in the 1940s with the scientific knowledge available 60 years later. They found that several highly complex data were in line with the current medical literature. The fact that a text written by an unlearned individual without academic training or involvement in the field of health, who resided in the hinterlands of Brazil during a time when access to articles was limited, the case of Mr. Francisco Candido Javier, furnishes highly complex concepts and information on the physiology of the pineal gland 60 years before any scientific confirmation, raises deeper questions as to the true source of this information. The first hypothesis is that the author, drawing on books and articles available in the 1940s detailing the physiopathology of the pineal gland and published before the isolation of melatonin, created these theories himself, wording them in non-specific language, thus allowing them to appear to be supported by subsequent advancements in science. A second hypothesis posits a mere coincidence of findings, whereby the author randomly created several theories surrounding the pineal gland, many of which happen to be confirmed by scientific evidence. The third hypothesis centers on alleged communication with spirits that have brought forward future findings related to the pineal gland.